Some say it's just a Super Mario Bros. Clone. Others cite it as one of the greatest games on the Commodore 64. The Great Giana Sisters' initial success was short-lived, however, when Nintendo allegedly sued its creator. This is the story of how Nintendo nearly killed the Giana Sisters. In the late 70s and early 80s, people played games in dimly lit arcade halls on big arcade machines. These arcades were the birthplace of a number of very popular games, and with their popularity on the rise, clones of these popular games began appearing. Space Attack, for example, released in 1979 by Sega, was a clone of Space Invaders. Snapper, released in 1982 by Acornsoft, was a Pac-Man clone. And Crazy Kong, released in 1981 by Falcon, was a Donkey Kong clone. In short, if a game became a hit, other companies tried to cash in on the hype. It is in this time period, the early 80s, that our story unfolds. One such popular game in the arcades was a game called Donkey Kong. The game was a huge commercial success for the Japanese company Nintendo. In 1983, the nameless main character from Donkey Kong got its own arcade game. The nameless plumber was given a name, Mario, and a brother, Luigi. The arcade game was called Mario Bros, and it was another big success for the Japanese game company. In 1985, the Mario Brothers would star in a new game, this time on Nintendo's home console, the NES. The game was a side-scrolling platform game called Super Mario Bros. This game absolutely blew up and is still frequently cited as one of the greatest video games of all time. It is also one of the best-selling games of all time, with more than 40 million physical copies sold worldwide. Mario Bros. Proved to be a very successful franchise for Nintendo. Rainbow Arts was a German video game developer and publisher founded in 1984 by Mark Ulrich. When Ulrich saw Super Mario Bros. On the NES in 1985, he was instantly intrigued and decided that a similar game for the home computer market could become a commercial success.
When he saw Super Mario Bros., he became very excited about it. Since there was no game like it available on home computers at the time, he saw a chance for a very successful game to be made using very similar game mechanics.
So, Ulrich assembled a team to work on a game based on Super Mario Bros. The team would consist of 3 people. Manfred Trenz was assigned to do the graphics, level design, and he also coded the high score routine for the game.
In 1986, there was a graphics competition in a magazine called 64. I sent some of my pics to them and I got rank number 3. A small company called Rainbow Arts saw these pics and got in contact with me. They asked me to do some graphics for their games. I then worked for them as a freelancer for some time. In 1987, they asked me to be part of the company as a graphics artist and I agreed. The first project was Giana Sisters. I did the graphics and also the level design and build-up.
Armin Gessert would become the programmer of the game. He already worked for Rainbow Arts previously on a game called Street Gang. For the musical score, Rainbow Arts contacted Chris Hulsbeck.
Shades was my first published tune and got a lot of attention because it won a competition in the biggest selling C64 magazine at the time. That helped to establish my name and basically also got me the job at Rainbow Arts, the first big German games developer.
A subsidiary of Rainbow Arts called Time Warp would be in charge of the production side of things, while the game would be published under the Rainbow Arts brand. The game was first released in West Germany in 1987, as mentioned in the game's main screen. This date is confirmed by the appearance of the first reviews of the game in German gaming magazines. Here, for example, is a review in Power Play issue 2 of 1987. Notably, however, these reviews don't appear in UK magazines until June of 1988, which suggests that the game was released in the UK a year later. This later UK release is important for our story, but more on that shortly. In 1988, 2 official ports were released for the Amiga and the Atari ST. Both versions were coded by Thomas Hertzler. There were also a few unofficial ports. The Amstrad CPC version, also released in 1988, was handled by Spike Productions. And finally, the MSX2 version, released in 1993, was done by Jan van Valburg. The Commodore 64 version received fantastic reviews by game magazines of the era. Zap64 described the game as amazing and concluded that the Great Giana Sisters was a fabulous, compelling and constantly rewarding arcade adventure. They gave the game a 96% score. Powerplay's review stated that they felt the game did not live up to the standards set by Super Mario Bros., but still achieves being an entertaining pleasure, giving the game an 80% score. Things were looking up for Rainbow Arts. Favorable reviews meant higher sales, but all that was about to change. The game cover of the initial German release featured a girl figure in a fantasy setting. The cover shows the name The Great Giana Sisters. Interestingly, the title scroll of the main menu of the game shows the name The Great Giana Sisters with 2 N's instead of 1, like depicted on the cover. This might seem like a major oversight during development, but there is a reason for this inconsistency. Rainbow Arts' intended name for the game was The Great Giana Sisters with 2 N's. Back in those days, cover art was often hand-drawn, and in this particular case it was airbrushed. When Rainbow Arts got the final game cover back from the designer, they noticed the designer had made an error in the word Giana. He omitted 1 N. It was, however, too close to the game's release to fix the cover, so the decision was made to adapt the new wrong name. The title scroll in the main menu is the only place remembering us of the original intended name. As mentioned before, the game's first release was in 1987, but in the UK the game wasn't released until somewhere around June the following year. Giana Sisters was sold for about a year until somebody from Nintendo spotted the game on display at a trade show in the UK during the summer of 1988. After Nintendo got wind of the game, they decided it had too many similarities to their game Super Mario Bros. Nintendo and Rainbow Arts didn't end up in court together, but Nintendo did apply legal pressure. Thomas Hertzler from Rainbow Arts recalls, "I believe that Nintendo filed something equivalent to a cease and desist order, but I do not think the case ever went to court." It was the German David against the Japanese Goliath, and Rainbow Arts had no other choice but to comply. The only thing I could find close to an official statement is this very short article from a gaming magazine in which Mark Ulrich from Rainbow Arts explains why they stopped shipping Giana Sisters: to avoid possible damages if a third party should take legal action. The third party obviously being Nintendo here. This is the reason we never saw the planned ZX Spectrum release. The only thing we have remembering that version are a few screenshots of an early build. This is also the reason for the insane amounts people are currently asking for the Commodore 64 version of the game. Because Rainbow Arts blatantly tried to make a game similar to Super Mario Bros., most people write Giana Sisters off as just a simple clone, but just how similar are these games, and is it just a clone or is there more to it? Let's start with the obvious, the name of the game. The name The Great Giana Sisters is a deliberate choice. Super Mario Bros. Became Great Giana Sisters, following the exact same syntax. Contrary to the Mario Brothers, Rainbow Arts created the Giana Sisters. Just like the name, the choice was made deliberately to mimic Nintendo's successful game. The basic gameplay of both games are very similar. They're obviously both platform games, but in both games you can destroy brick blocks when you have a power-up. Both games also let you collect coins, or in the case of Giana Sisters, diamonds, to save up for an extra life. The control of the characters, however, is distinctly different. Both Mario and Giana can walk, jump and skid. Mario can run, duck and do a running duck slide. Giana, however, can change direction in the air and do a ledge jump. There is a lot of science behind the movement of Mario, and it's safe to assume that the movement of Giana is probably an attempt to copy that science over. However, Giana Sisters at the end of the day controls a lot different than Mario Brothers. The controls in Super Mario Bros. Are tighter, while the Great Giana Sisters give you more floaty air control. The power-ups differ greatly. In Super Mario Bros. The first power-up is always the mushroom, for Giana this is the beach ball, and for both of them their appearance will change. Mario becomes bigger, but Giana transforms from a little girl into a punk girl. In Super Mario Bros., if you have a power-up, you can take one hit from an enemy. This will revert you back to small Mario. Get hit again then and you lose a life. Not so in Giana. No matter which power-up you have, if you hit an enemy, you die. Period. Koji Kondo's Super Mario Bros. Theme is iconic. Everybody knows that tune. Chris Julesbeck did an amazing job making all original SID tunes for the Great Giana Sisters. His theme song, which is the one used in the main menu, sounds fantastic. And the music used in the first level is equally amazing. The Great Giana Sisters, just like Super Mario Bros., has outside levels that are bright and colorful with matching uplifting music, but also underground levels that are dark and moody with matching more intense music. As for the levels themselves, the first two levels in Giana Sisters are designed in such a way that the start of these levels instantly reminds you of Super Mario Bros. The rest of the first two levels and all other 30 levels are completely original, but these similarities are one of the main reasons people call Giana Sisters a clone. Even if you ignore the obvious similarities between the two games, it was Rainbow Arts themselves that were aggressively pushing the narrative that they had a better game than Nintendo. The initial German cover art showed no reference to Super Mario Bros., but the cover for the UK release had the slogan "The Brothers Are History" printed on it. The brothers obviously refers to Mario Brothers. Advertisements of the Great Giana Sisters used slogans like "Move over, brothers," and "Where one famous double act stopped short, another begins." Rainbow Arts was pushing pretty aggressively towards comparing the two games. If they wanted Nintendo's attention, this sure was a way to get noticed. In Rainbow Arts' defense, it must be stated that companies in the late 80s were no stranger to this type of aggressive advertisements. Atari, for example, mocked the Nintendo Game Boy in favor of their Atari Lynx handheld with their slogan "Lynx eats boys lunch." Sega also openly went after Nintendo to promote the Sega Genesis in America with the slogan "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." Commodore on its turn took a stab at Sega while promoting the Amiga CD32 with the slogan "To be this good will take Sega ages," which in its turn was a play on words with Sega's own slogan "To be this good takes ages, to be this good takes Sega." It was a different time, a different mindset. Great Giana Sisters wasn't the first game from Rainbow Arts that borrowed its concept from another game. In 1987, the same year Rainbow Arts first released Giana Sisters, they released two more games that heavily leaned on other games. The first one being Thunder Boy, a game that borrowed its name and gameplay mechanics from a very popular game called, you guessed it, Wonder Boy. Unlike Giana Sisters, Thunder Boy not only used a similar name, but also borrowed the original game's aesthetics, weapons and, for the most part, enemy sprites. In the same year they also released a game called Katakis. 1 year later, after legal problems with Activision regarding the overwhelming similarities to R-Type, it was redesigned and renamed to Denaris. After getting mostly positive reviews on Giana Sisters and before Nintendo came into play, Rainbow Arts started working on a sequel. The game was called Giana 2: Arthur and Martha in Future World. Powerplay and Zap both show screenshots of the new game. It shows Giana in a futuristic setting with the name Giana clearly stated in the top left. In autumn of 1988, Rainbow Arts announced that the sequel was delayed due to the fact that they did not feel confident about the quality of the program. In reality, it's more likely the legal issues they had with Nintendo was the actual reason for the delay. Giana 2 was renamed to Hard and Heavy, and the sprite of the main character was altered to an android-looking character. The original cover art for the sequel showed a Giana-like figure clearly inspired by the original Giana Sisters cover. In the revised version, the figure wears a helmet, ridding it of all reference to Giana apart from the familiar pose. The game was eventually released in 1988 for the Commodore 64 and Commodore Amiga. It was released in Germany and possibly a few other surrounding countries. It was, however, not sold in the UK, probably because of the commotion that the first game ensued. So, what happened next? Somewhere in the 90s, Rainbow Arts was bought by Funsoft, which in its turn was eventually absorbed by THQ Germany in 1999. In 1994, Armin Gessert founded his own game development company called Spellbound Entertainment, which released several titles for Windows and macOS. In 2009, Armin Gessert's company released a game on the Nintendo DS. It would end up being the last game Gessert would ever work on. The company that almost killed the Giana Sisters franchise would also be the last company to release a game by Gessert's hands. A remake of Giana Sisters. Giana Sisters DS. Armin Gessert died on November 8, 2009, only months after the release of Giana Sisters on the Nintendo DS. He had been working in the video game industry for 25 years. Giana Sisters DS did eventually get ported to almost every major system, including the Xbox 360, Xbox One, PS3, PS4, Android, iOS, and even Nintendo's Wii U and Switch. In 2011, Gessert's company Spellbound Entertainment went bankrupt. After the company fell apart, most of the staff from Spellbound went on to form Black Forest Games. They took with them all Spellbound assets, including the IP The Great Giana Sisters. In July of 2012, Black Forest Game launched a successful Kickstarter campaign for a new installment of The Great Giana Sisters. For half of the musical score, they turned to the composer who also did the music for the original, Chris Hulbeck. And for the other part, the music was done by the Swedish Sid metal band Machine Supremacy. The result was Giana Sisters Twisted Dream, which was released on October 23, 2012 for PC. The game would later be released on Xbox 360, Xbox One, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Wii U and Switch. In 2014, local multiplayer was added to the game. In 2015, Black Forest Games released a game called Giana Sisters Dream Runners. This was an online multiplayer take on the Giana Sisters games. The game wasn't very well received. And finally, at the end of 2015, a PC port of the 2012 game Giana Sisters DS was released under the name Giana Sisters 2D. The port was done by a German development studio called Kazaa Solutions. Chris Hulbeck stayed active as a musician in the game scene. He has written soundtracks for over 70 game titles. Manfred Trenz went on to make the C64 version of R-Type in 1988 and the very popular Turrican games in the early 90s. In 2004 he started his own game studio named Denaris Entertainment Software, which focused on creating games for the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. As of the making of this video, the company website shows a blank page and Manfred seems to have vanished into thin air. So where does this leave Giana Sisters? The official IP is still owned by Black Forest Games, but no plan for a new Giana Sisters game are known. There are unofficial remakes like OpenGGS, Giana's Return and Giana Sisters SE, but these projects all seem to be abandoned. and forgotten. And so, this is where the story ends for the game that almost got killed by Nintendo, the Great Giana Sisters.